Okay. First of all, many thanks to the Fundación for inviting me to speak. You probably, I'm not an expert in Brazilian politics, but I do study Latin American politics. I've spent the last 30 years of my life devoted to studying Latin American democracies. And President Cardoso was, at the time that I began my studies, one of the leading sociologists in the world in studying Latin America. And so he has been an idol of mine since I was a very young man. And so it's a great honor to be here today. I apologize for not being able to give the talk in Portuguese. My Portuguese is horrible. My wife told me I should try to do it, but I chickened out. So let me start by pointing out something that I think is pretty obvious, but I think is important to say, which is that democracies don't die today the way they used to. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns, generals, militares. During the Cold War, 3 out of every 4 democratic breakdowns took the form of a military coup, like in Brazil in 1964. And actually, talking to people here, a lot of people in Brazil, I think, still think that that's kind of how democracies die. It's not. Today, democracies die in a much more subtle way. They die at the hands not of generals, but of elected leaders, elected presidents and prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. Since the end of the Cold War, a large majority of autocrats have come to power through elections, and they've used legal or constitutional means to consolidate their power. They use elections. They use plebiscites and referendums. They, in many cases, work through Congress, or they gain control of the courts, and they use judicial rulings to legalize or legitimize their rule. This is Chavez, it's Putin, it's Orban, it's Erdogan, Daniel Ortega, Rafael Correa, Duterte in Philippines, and many other cases. What makes this sort of electoral path to authoritarianism so dangerous is precisely that it's hidden behind a facade of democracy. Things look pretty normal. There is no dramatic coup d'etat where the military seized the presidential palace and the president is exiled and the constitution is suspended and a junta is set up. None of that. There are no tanks in the streets. You still have elections, you still have a Congress, you still have a constitution. In fact, the subversion of democracy in many cases is subtle, it is incremental, and sometimes it's very slow. Erdogan's party came to power in Turkey in 2002. It was not until 2007 or 8 that the regime really began to be authoritarian. Chavez was elected in 1998. It was not until 2006 or 2007 that it was clear that the regime had slid into authoritarianism. That's 7 or 8 years. So as a result, because it is so subtle, because the process of manipulating institutions is so subtle, incremental, slow, citizens often are not aware that they're losing their democracy until it is too late. In 2011, there was a survey in Venezuela. This is 13 years after Hugo Chavez was elected president. They found in 2011 that a majority of Venezuelans still believed that they were living under a democracy. They were not. So if democratic breakdown today begins at the ballot box, not in the barracks, one of the keys to protecting democracy is keeping authoritarians from getting elected in the first place. And that means we have to be able to identify authoritarians when they're still candidates. Back in the 1970s, the great political scientist Juan Linz, who really devoted the bulk of his career to studying how democracies die. He was born in Weimar, Germany, raised in Spain during the Civil War, and really devoted his professional career to figuring out how democracies die. He wrote a very, very widely circulated book in the 1970s called The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, in which he proposed what he called a litmus test to identify authoritarian behavior. Daniel, my co-author, and I took that litmus test and kind of updated it and revised it. Linz wasn't always the clearest of writers, and presented kind of an updated version of that litmus test in our book. The test includes 4 types of candidate behavior that should set off warning bells, that should make us nervous, that should make us worry if we see it. These are the four. And these come mostly from Linz. One is a rejection of democratic rules of the game, a refusal to play by democratic rules of the game, pretty obvious. A second one is toleration or encouragement of violence. A third is a denial of the legitimacy of one's partisan rivals, opponents. And a fourth is an expressed willingness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents, including in the media. When a politician exhibits one or more of these behaviors, we should worry. And more importantly, we should not elect them. Now, obviously, there is no perfect, no fail-safe mechanism for identifying autocrats. But in our research, we found that most elected autocrats do, in fact, pass this test. They do, in fact, exhibit signs of authoritarianism. They reveal their authoritarianism before they get elected. There are a few who say scary things while they're candidates and they end up behaving themselves in office. But the vast majority of them do what they say they're going to do. They behave as authoritarians as candidates, they engage in authoritarian discourse as candidates, and they attack democratic institutions as presidents and prime ministers. Chavez, Erdogan, Ortega, Duterte, Correa, there are many others. So the lesson I take from that is we need to take what candidates say seriously. They're not bluffing. Now, extremist candidates, authoritarian figures, appear in all democracies from time to time. The United States has a long history of them. The question is, how do we keep them away from the center of power? And here, and again, we draw heavily on Juan Linz. The political elite, and particularly political parties, play a very, very important role. Elected authoritarians rarely come to power on their own. They almost always get help from the political establishment. Somebody from the political or economic elite opens the door for them. Some mainstream politicians calculate that an alliance, working with, flirting with, this extremist figure can help them politically in the short run, help them win power, help them stay in power, help them defeat somebody else that they don't like. And the assumption is that if this extremist wins power, the establishment can control him. That deal, that Faustian bargain, often backfires. In Italy in the 1920s, liberal leader Giovanni Giolitti, seeking to tap into the fascists' mass appeal, put Mussolini's fascist candidates on his list for parliament, normalizing, legitimizing the fascist party. That did not end well. In Germany, in the late 1920s, conservative leaders forged an alliance with Hitler, hoping to sort of tap into Hitler's grassroots support to shore up their own declining base. The conservatives were in decline. When conservatives started to worry about Hitler after he was named chancellor in 1932, conservative leader Franz von Papen told his conservative allies, "Don't worry. Within 2 months, we'll have pushed him so far into a corner, he will squeal." More recently in Venezuela, former President Rafael Caldera publicly sympathized with Hugo Chávez's first coup attempt in 1992, helping to legitimize Chávez. 2 years later as president, he let Chávez out of prison. Caldera knew very well that Hugo Chávez was a dangerous demagogue, but he was convinced that Chávez would sort of fade away politically before the 1998 election. So in all three of these cases, Italy, Germany, Venezuela, mainstream politicians opened the door to extremists. In all three cases, it turned out to be a tragic mistake. Again, Juan Linz devoted the bulk of his career to studying how democracies die. One of the primary lessons that he drew is that mainstream politicians must do everything humanly possible to keep would-be authoritarians away from the center of power. Not only must they be willing to resist the temptation to align with extremists, which seems pretty straightforward, but they also have to be willing, if necessary, to join forces with ideological rivals in defense of democracy. In Linz's words, I want to quote this because I think it's important, when faced with an authoritarian threat, mainstream politicians, Juan Linz writes, must join with opponents who are ideologically distant but committed to the survival of the democratic political order. Italian liberals, German conservatives, and Rafael Caldera failed to do that. Their democratic political orders collapsed. Now, Daniel and I wrote this book. We wrote How Democracies Die because we were worried about American democracy. So inevitably, I have to talk a little bit about the United States. In 2016, the United States Republican Party also failed to heed Juan Linz's advice. Donald Trump tested unambiguously positive on our authoritarian litmus test. He threatened not to accept the results of the election. He threatened to jail his opponent. He encouraged violence at his campaign rallies, and he threatened legal action against critics in the media. Checks all 4 boxes on our test. Republican leaders knew perfectly well that Donald Trump was a demagogue. They knew damn well that he was unfit for office, excuse my language. But resisting a demagogue on one's own side of the political spectrum is hard. It often means short-term political defeat, and no politician anywhere likes to lose. So politicians often rationalize. They tell themselves and they tell others that the demagogue may not be so bad, that they can control him, and that in any event, it's better handing power to him than handing power to one's ideological rivals. And that's what Republican leaders did. No Republican leader, not a single national elected Republican official, no governor, no senator, no member of Congress, was willing to do the one thing that would have ensured Trump's defeat. That is, endorse Hillary Clinton. The fact that not a single Republican endorsed Hillary Clinton sent a very clear message to Republican voters. It told them that it was a normal election, that Donald Trump was a normal candidate, that this was a normal two-party race. And in the context of a so-so economy, in the context of a closely divided electorate, that was enough to get Donald Trump elected. So now Americans are faced with a potentially authoritarian president. That's where political institutions come into play. And I want to talk a little bit about formal and informal institutions. Americans, as you probably know, have a lot of pride and a lot of faith in our Constitution. And in fact, our constitutional system of checks and balances has constrained many powerful and ambitious presidents in the past. Andrew Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt, Nixon. But one of the key arguments of our book is that constitutions by themselves are not enough to save a democracy, to protect a democracy. They have to be reinforced, supported, complemented by unwritten rules, what we call democratic norms. And the book focuses on 2 norms in particular. The first is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of one's partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we disagree with the other party, no matter how much we dislike the other party, we accept, at least in public, that they are loyal citizens who love the country just as much as we do, and who have an equal and legitimate right to compete for power, and if they win elections, to govern. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm is what we call forbearance. This is a little trickier. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of self-restraint. It is an underutilization of power. We do not often think about forbearance in politics, particularly in Latin American politics, but it is absolutely vital to making democracy work. Think for just a second about what the U.S. president is constitutionally able to do, legally able to do. The president can pardon whoever he wants at any time for whatever reason he wants.
Even himself.
That's unclear, but the Constitution doesn't rule it out. That may be tested. Any president of the United States with a majority in Congress, like Donald Trump has today, can pack the Supreme Court. The president does not like the ideological makeup of the Supreme Court. His allies in Congress can pass a law expanding it from 9 to 11 to 13 to 15 and fill it with loyalists. Perfectly legal to do that. Or think about what the U.S. Congress can do. Congress can refuse to fund the government. It can shut the government down. And as all of you know, the Congress can remove the president for any reason it wants, legally. My point here is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution, even a very good Constitution like the United States is, can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that undermine, even eviscerate the spirit of the Constitution. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet, a Harvard professor, calls this sort of behavior constitutional hardball. I do not know how to translate constitutional hardball into Portuguese. Good luck, whoever's doing the translation. But I'm going to use that term, constitutional hardball. It is the use of the letter of the law to undermine the spirit of the law. You look at any failing or failed democracy anywhere in the world, and you will find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Germany and Spain in the 1930s, Argentina under Perón, Venezuela under Chavez, contemporary Hungary, Turkey, Poland. Constitutional hardball should be familiar to anybody who follows Latin American politics. Court packing is one example. The Argentines are masters of constitutional hardball. Presidents Perón, Menem, Kirchner all packed the Supreme Court. They did it in ways that were technically legal, constitutional. Impeachment can be an instance of constitutional hardball. Impeachment is a very powerful tool because what you're doing when you impeach the president is you are challenging, violating, distorting the will of the electorate, the mandate of the electorate. So it is a very powerful tool, a tool that at least in the United States, constitutional scholars agree should be used very sparingly, should be used with restraint, with forbearance. In Latin America, we have a number of instances in which forbearance has not been used, in which impeachment has been used as a form of constitutional hardball. It's been used by Congresses who don't like the president simply as a means of getting rid of a president they don't like. I think the clearest case of all is Paraguay in 2012, when President Lugo was impeached in 2 days. The president of Paraguay was given 2 hours to defend himself. It was a show trial. Another one of my favorite cases is Ecuador in 1997. Congress did not like President Abdallah Bucaram. They did not have the 2/3 votes that they needed to legally impeach Bucaram, so they used a clause in the Constitution that allows a mere majority to remove the president for mental incapacity. Now, we can debate whether Abdallah Bucaram suffered from mental incapacity, but the Ecuadorian Congress did not spend even 5 minutes debating whether he actually suffered from mental incapacity. They simply used the letter of that rule to remove the president. Constitutional hardball turns what should be neutral institutions into partisan weapons, into weapons that are used against one's opponents. That, if frequent enough, can undermine and even kill a democracy. This is Peronist Argentina, it's Chavista Venezuela, it's Erdogan's Turkey. What prevents a constitutional democracy from descending into regime-threatening constitutional hardball is the norm of forbearance. It's a shared commitment by politicians to institutional restraint, to defending the spirit of the law above and beyond the letter of the law. It is basically politicians saying, yes, legally I can do that, but we don't do things that way here. That's incredibly important in a democracy. Now, in the United States, we argue in the book that norms of mutual toleration and forbearance were pretty strong throughout the 20th century. But we also argue that in the last couple of decades, those norms are weakening in our country. During the Obama presidency in particular, Republicans began to abandon mutual toleration. Republican leaders told their followers over and over again, in public and in private, that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. Hillary Clinton suffered a similar treatment. Donald Trump repeatedly called her a criminal, and Republicans chanted, "Lock her up," live on national television in their party Congress. The erosion of mutual toleration, the fact that Republicans have begun to question the legitimacy of their rivals, call them not American, call them criminal, worries us. Because without mutual toleration, politicians are encouraged, tempted, often pushed to engage in constitutional hardball. What do I mean? When we view our rivals as enemies, when we view our rivals as an existential threat, we're tempted to use any means necessary to prevent them from gaining power. And that is beginning to happen in the United States. Constitutional hardball is on the rise in the United States. An early example was the partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton in 1998, basically on a technicality. That was the first impeachment in the United States in 130 years. In the last decade, about a dozen Republican-controlled states have passed legislation making it harder for poor and minority citizens who tend to vote Democrat to vote. They're trying to tilt the playing field by restricting the electorate. Most stunning of all, in my opinion, was the Senate's refusal in 2016 to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by the death of Justice Antolin Scalia. That was the first time that that happened, that Congress had refused to allow the president to even try to fill a spot in the court. First time that happened since 1866, since the Civil War. So the soft guardrails that have been protecting our democracy are weakening in the United States. So what causes that? What causes norms of mutual toleration and forbearance to weaken, to erode? We argue in the book that it's primarily a product of polarization. Let me talk a little bit about the United States, and I'll move on to Brazil. In the United States, Republicans and Democrats have come over the last 20 years to fear and loathe one another. One interesting piece of data. A survey in 1960 found that 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats said they would be unhappy if their kid, if their child, married somebody from the other party. Today, it's 50%. 50%. 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. Afraid. We have not seen that level of fear, partisan fear and hatred, since the end of the Civil War. And this is not traditional left-right polarization. America's partisan differences run deeper than that. They're about race, religion, and culture. So whereas the Democratic Party has become a very heterogeneous mix of urban secular whites and a range of ethnic minorities, the Republican Party remains overwhelmingly white and Christian. So what? Why does that matter? It matters because white Christians are not just any group in the United States. They were once a dominant electoral majority, and more than that, they used to sit unchallenged atop the country's social, economic, political hierarchies. They filled the presidency, they filled the Congress, they filled the Supreme Court, the governor's mansions, they were the CEOs of the major companies, they were the newscasters on television, they were the movie stars, they were the college professors. Those days are over, as you all know, but losing a majority and losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in has been taken away from them. That, we think, is what ultimately drives polarization in the United States. The problem is, polarization can kill democracies. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views a victory by the other side as something that is intolerable, unacceptable, democracy is in trouble, because when an opposition victory is seen as something that's intolerable, you start to justify using extraordinary measures to prevent that from happening. Things like violence, things like election fraud, things like coups. That's what happened in Spain in the 1930s. It's what happened in Argentina for decades after the rise of Perón. It's what happened in Brazil in the early 60s. It's what happened in Chile in the 1970s. U.S. democracy, and this is where I'm going to stop talking about my country, is far from dead. It still has pretty robust institutions. But the democratic norms, the informal, unwritten rules that used to sustain our institutions are being eroded by polarization. So I think there is real reason for concern in my country. All right, so what about Brazil? I, again, am not an expert on Brazilian politics, so don't take anything I say very seriously. But I think our book's arguments are relevant here too. First and foremost, most obviously perhaps, like the United States in 2016, Brazilians face the specter of an authoritarian presidential candidate. My host, Rodrigo, requested that I do a little homework before my visit here, so a couple of research assistants at Harvard helped me do some research on Bolsonaro, and we applied our litmus test to Bolsonaro. Here are the results. You probably will not be surprised that he tests positive in flying colors. Indicator number one, does he reject democratic rules of the game? Throughout his career, as far as we can tell, going back to the 1980s, Bolsonaro has praised the military dictatorship and challenged the legitimacy of the post-1985 democracy. In 1993, he declared, "I am for dictatorship," called for the closure of Congress, like in Fujimori's Peru the year earlier. More recently, Bolsonaro declared that what happened in 1964 was not a coup. He promised a Chavista-like packing of the Supreme Court, and he questioned the legitimacy of Brazil's electoral system, calling it rigged. He just named as his vice presidential candidate a general who at various points has signaled his openness to a military coup. So not only has Bolsonaro rejected democratic rules of the game, but he's actually done so in a way that is more open and more egregious than Erdogan, than Fujimori, than Chavez, than Orban. None of those guys openly embraced dictatorship. Okay, so he passes that one. Check that box. Indicator number two, toleration or encouragement of violence. In 1998, Bolsonaro said the military should have killed 30,000 people, including Fernando Henrique Cardoso. He's encouraged the extrajudicial police killing of suspected criminals. He has embraced death squads in Rio de Janeiro. He's justified the extrajudicial killing of 19 farm workers in Pará in 1996. Indicator number three, denying the legitimacy of one's partisan rivals. Bolsonaro has called President Cardoso a corrupto who should have been killed during the dictatorship. He calls Lula a criminal, wants to imprison him, and says he, if in government, will treat the MST as terrorists. Indicator number four, a willingness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents. Bolsonaro has repeatedly endorsed the use of torture and extrajudicial killing, including against leftist politicians and activists. So Bolsonaro is a thoroughly authoritarian figure. That distinguishes him, and I think this is very important, that distinguishes him from all of his rivals, all of his major rivals in the 2018 presidential race. It distinguishes him from Alckmin, from Marina Silva, from Haddad, from Ciro. My host also requested that I do a little research on these other candidates, and we did. None of them show up on this litmus test. Ciro Gomes, from the best of my research, has a big mouth. But we found no evidence of authoritarian tendencies. Being hot-tempered and being offensive is not the same thing as being authoritarian. Taking bribes, as Lula allegedly did, is not the same thing as being authoritarian. This is very important. Center-left politicians, even corrupt ones, do not generally threaten democracy. Authoritarian candidates do threaten democracy. So Brazil may be headed to one of those critical moments that Linz wrote about, when political and economic elites may have to choose, may be forced to choose between their short-term political and policy goals and the long-term defense of democratic institutions. And the overwhelming lesson of my research is that Brazilian elites should resist the temptation to back Bolsonaro under any circumstance, under any second-round scenario you can imagine. I worry when I read that Bolsonaro was applauded by the National Confederation of Industry last month, and that according to CNI President Robson Andrade, many entrepreneurs like Bolsonaro because he shows authority. I worry a lot that business leaders will decide that Bolsonaro is worth the risk because of the economic policies that Paulo Guedes can deliver, or maybe because it's just better than having to deal with a government led by Ciro or Haddad. This is the historic mistake that Italian liberals made. It's the mistake that German conservatives make. It's the mistake that U.S. Republicans are making today. Okay, so how strong are Brazil's democratic norms? My sense, and I'm, again, not an expert, is that between the early 1990s and somewhere in Dilma's presidency, they were actually relatively strong, certainly by Latin American standards. The two main parties, the PT and the PSDB, accepted one another as legitimate. They didn't like each other very much. They competed pretty intensely. They did not treat each other as enemies or as an existential threat. And Brazilian politicians engaged in a certain amount of forbearance, the kind of constitutional hardball that we saw in countries throughout the 1990s and 2000s that we saw in Argentina and Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia was less common in Brazil. For the most part, in the 1990s and well into the 2000s, Brazilian politicians largely refrained from egregiously using institutions as weapons against their opponents. There were no Kirchner or Menem or Chavez-style court packings. There were no politicized impeachments like in Ecuador and Paraguay. There were no efforts to exclude major candidates like in Mexico and Peru. And of course, there were no constitutional reinterpretations that allowed the president to run for a third or fourth or fifth term. But like the United States, it looks very much to me like Brazil's democratic norms have been weakening considerably in the last 4 or 5 years. Politics, as all of you know, has polarized, and as a result, mutual toleration has begun to erode. So during Dilma's presidency, many people on the center-right began to view the PT as an existential threat. They worried that the PT was becoming a dominant party bent on entrenching itself in power for decades, like the Mexican PRI. Some on the right even began to describe the PT as a totalitarian threat. For their part, PT leaders have been describing even their moderate center-right opponents as golpista, especially since Dilma's impeachment. Some petistas even call their right-wing opponents fascist. This is a problem. Again, the erosion of the loss of mutual toleration encourages the politics of constitutional hardball, because when we view our rivals as enemies, when we view our rivals as golpistas or as totalitarians, we become tempted to use any means necessary to defeat them. And in fact, Brazilian politics has seen a rise in constitutional hardball. Dilma's impeachment, I disagree with my PT friends. Dilma's impeachment was not a coup. It was entirely legal. It was entirely constitutional. It was, though, a case of constitutional hardball. Dilma was impeached, in my view, basically on a technicality for political reasons. Dilma, of course, also engaged in constitutional hardball. One obvious case is when she tried to name Lula as her chief of staff in order to protect him from prosecution. Or take the case of Lula and his imprisonment. His exclusion from the 2018 election is clearly legal. It may well be justified. But it's also a case of judicial hardball, because judges very clearly sped up the case and they have pressed the law to the hilt. Lula did not have to be imprisoned before the 2018 election. Even if you think that is the right thing to do, and there are many people who legitimately think that is the right thing to do, the political consequences of that kind of hardball can be quite damaging. We now have a situation in Brazil in which a major political party, the PT, believes that its rivals are playing dirty. Petistas believe that their party was illegitimately removed from power in 2016, and they believe that Lula's imprisonment is a blatantly anti-democratic move to keep them from regaining power in 2018. And polls show that nearly half the country agrees with them. This is a real problem. Brazil is facing a real problem of polarization. On the one hand, much of the center and center-right fears that the PT wants to perpetuate itself in power and that it will use any means necessary to do that. On the other hand, on the other side, the PT sees, the PSDB sees other opposition parties as having used illegitimate means to remove it from power and is now using illegitimate means to keep it from power. Both sides today view the other side as dangerous. Both sides view the other side as anti-democratic. Both sides view the other side as an existential threat. To make matters worse, this is all happening. This polarization is happening in a context in which mass support for democracy is eroding. I'm sure you guys have all seen the numbers. The percentage of Brazilians who say that democracy is always the best system has fallen from 77% in 2010 to 56% today. Fewer than 20% of Brazilians say they're satisfied with their democracy, and there are polls that show that nearly half the country is willing to entertain the idea of a coup under some circumstances. Now, the erosion of mass support for democracy was probably inevitable given Lava Jato and given the economic crisis. The erosion of mass support for democracy is not irreversible. It was very low in the 1980s and 90s. The origin of mass support for democracy is not fatal for democracy, but it does make it more vulnerable. And it means that it's up to the elite, at least now, in this moment, to defend it. It means it's up to the elite to defend democracy. So why should the elite defend democracy? I want to close by offering a few reasons. First of all, there is no reason, no evidence in social sciences that authoritarianism will provide any better solutions to Brazil's problems. There's been a lot of research in economics and in political science into the question of whether dictatorships perform better than democracies in terms of economic growth. And the results are pretty clear. They don't. They perform about the same. A few dictatorships have performed really well, Singapore, Taiwan, now China. But those are outliers. For every Singapore and China, there are dozens of authoritarian regimes across the world that perform spectacularly badly in the economic realm. Dictatorships are also no better at fighting corruption, despite popular perceptions. In fact, the data suggest that they're somewhat worse than democracies at combating corruption. So the data suggests there's very little to gain from authoritarianism, but I think there's a lot to lose. Strong democratic institutions are not easy to build. Strong democratic institutions take a very long time to build. They take decades. It takes decades to establish civilian control over the military. It takes decades to build an independent judiciary and a strong legislature. You may disagree with me, but I actually think Brazilians have done a tremendous job at that over the last 30 or 35 years. Never before in history have civilian control of the military, judicial independence, and civil and human rights been as entrenched as they are in Brazil over the last quarter century. A slide into authoritarianism, even a brief slide into authoritarianism, can wipe out decades of institution building. That is a problem that has long plagued countries I know a lot better, like Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia. Because historically democracy is broken down every time there's a crisis, institutions, democratic institutions, have never been given the time they need to take root. It is a vicious circle, one that the Peruvians and the Argentines are still today trying to climb out of. Finally, the fate of your democracy has consequences that extend far beyond Brazil. The last 30 years have been far and away the most democratic period in Latin American history. But as all of you know, the international environment is much less favorable to democracy today than it was in the 1990s, for reasons that are obvious. At the same time, public satisfaction, public support for democracy has eroded, has declined across much of Latin America. It's not just Brazil. It's Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Peru, even Chile and Costa Rica. Brazil is a really influential country. If democracy fails here, it could trigger a wave of democratic breakdowns across Latin America. It wouldn't be the first time. The 1964 coup had an enormous impact in Latin America. It helped to encourage militaries to seize power in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, and Peru, eventually in Chile and Uruguay. It would be truly tragic, in my opinion, if that kind of history were to repeat itself. Let me stop there. Thank you.